We already listened to Dr. Jenkins and Rasby, and they talked about feeding the cows and maintaining body condition, and those things are so important that it leaves me without very much to talk about, because we had some pretty healthy calves in this first year of this trial. It's good to be back in Lincoln coming from Mississippi. When I went down to Mississippi, I learned something that beef production systems are really quite variable depending on where you come from. But there are some common elements to that. One is that in spite of the variety of ways that you may market your calves or what your goals are, personal or business goals in producing those calves, you still have to start with a calf, which means you have to have had a successful calving and a healthy pregnancy to get there, right? And those things are functions of the natural resources that you have available to you. So your land and grass and the things like that. Your human resources, which is your ability to make good management decisions, your ability to hire good labor, all of the people resources that are important to make that ranch operate, and capital. All right, so the capital is obviously the money and the facilities that you might have. Often we're limiting in one or more of these areas, and so it makes life interesting in beef cattle production. So cattle ranches are biological systems, and that means that from time to time Mother Nature throws some cards on the table that we maybe weren't prepared to deal with. So lots of things can interfere with our ability to get cows pregnant, have healthy calves born, and be able to market those calves. All right, so collectively, we try to do a lot of different things to try to mitigate the risks for those problems that Mother Nature or the economy or other things might deal to us. And collectively, that makes ranches complex adaptive systems. So they're complex because you can't predict what the outcomes are going to be ahead of time, right? They're massive. There's all kinds of things that are going on, and we don't always know what the endpoint's going to look like. They're adaptive because we change, we learn from what happens to us. So, every once in a while you'll hear a rancher say, "I'm not going to do that again," right? And that's because they've learned something from this complex system. The system is moved. It's changed because of the various things that have inward and outward pressures on it. The people learn and the cattle learn, right? So it's adaptive, and so that's the thing that brings us to this thought of looking at cattle ranches in a systems dynamics type of a format. So beef cattle have traditionally been raised in a system where there is a renewable resource, grass, that drives the cattle industry, right? So we commonly think of the grass as being this renewable resource that drives the system. But in recent years, we've learned that every once in a while, the grass is not a renewable resource, and we need to find other resources in order to feed the system. And so in Nebraska, that might mean that the alternatives to the grass that we'd like to have our cattle grazing on might be stored feeds, harvested feeds, corn stalks, distillers' grains, other things. And that might come at different costs and dramatically change the system. So what I'm going to talk about in this next half hour is confined cow-calf production systems and how that might affect the health and well-being of the cows and the calves that are in that system, how we might adapt the system to avoid some of the important foreseeable hazards and recognize that there are some hazards that are out there that are a little bit unpredictable. So I've been warned lots and lots of times not to come to a beef meeting and show pictures of dairy cows, but I just want to make the point that we've got some experience working with cattle in confinement in dairy systems. A lot of people in the last few years in the beef industry have learned an awful lot about raising cows in confinement. So it's not that we're completely void of of information in this area. What I can tell you is that as you put cows into confinement systems, you're taking more and more of the decision-making process away from the cow and putting it on your shoulders, right? So the cow no longer gets to decide where she's going to take her calf and when she's going to go lay down, what she's going to eat, and when she's going to feed that calf. A lot of those things you're making the decisions for, and that means that when you make a mistake, it can be a really big mistake. So we just have to pay attention to the extra effort that's required to manage the cows in confinement systems. Also recognize that there's lots of advantages. So we can do a lot more things because those cattle are right there and they're up. And when things need to be done, we don't have to compromise on the fact that they're out far away and we can't get to them. So let's take a risk analysis point of view to think about what we ought to be worried about in terms of health and productivity of cows and calves in confinement. So there's a system of thinking about these things called risk analysis. One of the phases is risk assessment, and that's where you ask the questions about, well, what is it that I should be afraid of? Is it a serious problem? How likely is it to happen? What would it cost if it did? How does that compare to other risks that I'm willing to take? So that's the risk assessment phase, and we're going to do that in a second. The next phase is risk management, and that's where you say, well, what can we do to minimize those problems? And if we do those things, are we going to create some other problem that might even be worse? And then finally, the documentation and communication phase is where we say, does everybody understand what we're doing here and why we're doing it? Did we write down what we did, and did it work? Okay, so a lot of times when we give these talks, we don't spend enough time in this last phase, but it's probably the most important. So let's do a risk assessment. What do we think are the things that might give us problems in terms of health and productivity of our calves if we raise them in a confinement system? So this is a survey that was done. This is not from confined cattle. This is a survey done by USDA a few years ago looking at reasons for cows and calves in cow-calf beef production systems to die. So these surveyed herds all over the beef-producing states of the United States, 2.5% of the calves were born dead, and another 3.5% died or were lost somehow prior to weaning. And so this pie chart then represents where those losses occurred. So 44.5% of those were calves that were born dead. They died in dystocia or some problem, they were not delivered alive. Another 13.5% died within the first day of birth. 28% died in the first 3 weeks. So let me just point out right now that 86% of the calves that died on these ranches died in the first 3 weeks of life. Right? So that's a major critical time period to be thinking about, worrying about losses associated with whatever the production system is. Another 14% died after 3 weeks, but prior to weaning. So what about that first 3 weeks of life? What did they die from? The survey said that about a fourth of them were those birth-related problems, the dystocias. Another fourth were weather-related. About 20% were unknown, undiagnosed reasons for death. 14% digestive and 18% respiratory diseases. So that's another about 22% of the reasons for calves to die. And about 6% of the calves died from predation or injury. All right, so taking those collectively, looking at the reasons why calves died on these ranches across the U.S., problems occurring during and around the time of calving, dangers from the environment, and contagious diseases. Okay, so we'll address a little bit more. So after weaning, what were the reasons for losses? Well, that would be in weaned calves or in the cows, and calving-related problems led the list. There were some other known causes. A lot of those were well, it was old age or some things like that. Also a lot of unknown causes, but you can see that calving-related injuries, again, leads the list of problems to anticipate. All right, so let's break those three down and talk about risks at calving time. So what are the important hazards at the time of calving? Well, the big one is just that problem with dystocia. And we're all familiar with that. Of the problems with dystocia in beef cattle, it's largely because of a large calf relative to the size of the cow. We can manage that. Dystocias are much less of a problem today than they were when I was in practice 20 years ago. We've solved a lot of those problems through genetics. So we can manage that by thinking about our breeding programs. We can think about when we are going to have those problems that we can't prevent, how do we address them? Are we prepared to address them? So I could spend a lot of time, this is a favorite topic of mine, but I won't spend time on it. I almost pulled these slides out about dystocia management, but they're so important that I thought, well, at least I want to buzz through them so that you can see that I think they're important. So we need to know how to handle dystocias, and we need to manage them appropriately. So if somebody told you somewhere in your career that it's okay to put dirty hands in a cow's uterus, they were wrong about that. We need to be clean, and we need to use lots of lubricants when we're managing those things. And when we don't know what's wrong or we can't fix it, we need to know to call for help before it's too late. Okay. Dangers from the environment. So this is not a cow, this image is not from a confinement calving system, but I wanted to just give you the idea of, we're talking about now a more crowded environment that we're dealing with. And so what are the problems that we might see? Predation was on our list of problems from the environment in all systems. They said that it was dogs first, coyotes second, and mountain lions third in terms of predators. So probably not a big problem in confinement, much less likely you're going to have those problems from predators. My experience is that you take away the predators and calves decide to kill themselves, right? So they hang themselves in gates and they get caught in wire and they get under some cow and let her step on her and break a leg. There's all kinds of things that happen that in confinement that are less likely to be seen in more extensive calving systems. The weather may be more critical in confinement systems. So mud is bad anywhere, and mud in a calving system in a dry lot is just horrible. So we might choose to move our calving system, the time that we're going to calve, to a time period that avoids mud. That means that we're either going to be facing, freezing weather, cold weather, or maybe dry, hot weather. And both of those present a risk to the calf in its first day of life because it's not really able to regulate its body temperature very well. So we may have calves freezing or having heat stress because they're not able to regulate their body temperature. That may mean that we have to be prepared to address those temperature things in the early days of life. Preventing infectious diseases. Another favorite of mine, infectious diseases. I spent a lot of time thinking about how we manage cattle systems to prevent transmission of pathogens. So this battle between infectious agents in cow-calf systems and it begins at birth. That calf, the first thing that goes into its mouth might be the colostrum that's going to provide it some immunity from those pathogens, or it might be the pathogens that are going to kill it. We know that whatever it absorbs in terms of antibodies is going to decrease with time, and the calf's immune system, while it's able to mount an immune response, it's slow and inefficient and a little bit weak until the calf is about 5 to 8 months of age. All right, that leaves some period of time where we're losing antibodies, but we haven't really built our good, strong, active immune response. So we might have this window of vulnerability. and with high enough levels of exposures, we may see calves get sick. With scours, that happens early because we're talking about the protection that occurs in the gut. So those antibodies are absorbed. Absorbed in the first 24 hours of life, and they're slowly secreted back into the gut. What we'll typically see with calves getting scours is that happens in the first 1 or 2 weeks of life. And Dr. Grodelucian I spoke to just a little bit ago, he and I and some veterinarians in Nebraska and a number of others looked at this type of relationship in ranches in the sandhills. And what we observed was that the incidence of disease gets increasingly greater over the course of the calving season. So while things start off looking pretty good, by the end of the calving season, we have high rates of scours in some herds. We can explain that because the cow serves as the reservoir from one year to the next. She's shedding those pathogens into the environment. The first calf that's exposed grows those up into larger numbers. As time progresses, those calves shed out even greater levels, and so by the time we're at the end of the calving season, we largely have an environment that's full of exposure to pathogens. So we looked at when calves were born and their risk for dying from scours. It was not a problem at the beginning, but it was a big problem at the end of the calving season. And so it was the reason why we devised this system that we called the Sandhills calving system, so that we're moving cows to a clean pasture or dry lot every week, so that we're avoiding and we're leaving those pairs behind, so that we're leaving those pairs of calves, those calves that are the most infective to the calves being born. The greatest risk to the calf being born is that calf that's 1 or 2 weeks older, going to expose it to pathogens and make it sick. So we can break that cycle by creating, for example, 8 one-week calving seasons instead of 1 8-week calving season. All right, eventually we run out of lots and we feel like they're not at risk for scours after they're a month of age, and so we can start to pull them together again if we need to manage them that way. Let's talk about respiratory disease because there's a similar story there. So those antibodies from colostrum are decreasing. The active immune response hasn't increased. In fact, we can put some numbers to this. We know that those circulating antibodies have a half-life of 16 days. Every 16 days, whatever that calf had in terms of antibodies is half that much. Another 16 days, it's half of that again. So that you can see by the time a calf is 90 to 100 days of age, whatever it started with in terms of antibodies from its mom, they're gone. They're largely gone. And we've got this 5 to 8 months to wait for a really strong active immune response. All right? And so that probably explains why we see that calves in that 90 to 120 days of age are the most likely to get sick from respiratory disease. So the risk increases with age, and then they start to have their active immune response, and the risk decreases again. So that calf that's 90 to 120 days of age, regardless of whether it's out there in a ranch pasture or in a dry lot confinement system, its greatest risk for, its greatest susceptibility to these pathogens is right in that 90 to 120 days of age range. So any opportunities to increase exposure to pathogens, commingling, or anything that increases the stress level of the calf, if they're prior to or during that 3 to 4 month of age period of time, is additional risks. Vaccines are very important for reducing the incidence of BRD in calves, but we're not really good at knowing how to vaccinate calves in that pre-weaning period to really protect them. So it's an active area of research right now for us to say there's good protocols for protecting those calves at that early age, but scientifically we're not really there yet. There are some other contagious diseases that maybe are particular concerns Not that they don't occur out on pasture, but they could be a particular concern in confinement systems. Pink eye is one of those. So pink eye is partly due to infectious pathogens, partly due to injuries to the eye. So you've got calves that are coming up to the bunks and we're blowing feed in, and we have more opportunities to have irritants in the eyes. So we get pink eye for those reasons. Coccidiosis is a protozoal disease. Can happen out on pasture, but we're in a confinement system where calves are defecating in maybe, or climbing in the feed bunks and defecating in the feeds. There's greater opportunities for that transmission. So being aware of those disease processes and managing so that those events don't occur is also important. Well, so here's the data from the first year of experience with the UNL herd. They had 84 pregnant cows that came in to the feedlot here at Meade on the east side of the state, or at Mitchell on the western side of the state. So there's 42 cows in each group. They calved between May 1st and July 30th, and we used the Sandhills calving system in this dry lot setting. So they moved cows as they were calving over the course of the season. And this graph represents when cows calve. So you may not be able to see the numbers, but this first calf is May 1st. The last calf born was on July 4th. So at Mitchell, there was one calf treated for pneumonia at 2 days of age. One cow was euthanized after a uterine prolapse. So she's one of those deaths that occurred, at and around calving. At Meade, 2 calves were born premature and died. More losses right at the day of birth. And 1 calf died due to injury. No calves at either location experienced neonatal calf diarrhea. So that's a good thing, right? Maybe the Sandhills calving system gave them some protection. The early weaned calves, so we've talked about this already. They were sorted according to the dam's body weight category in depends of 5 to 7 calves at each location. On September 25th, that's when the ones that were weaned were weaned. Then there was another group that stayed with their dams in corresponding similar types of pens. Okay, so those calves were weaned at 86 days of age. The youngest calf was 59 days old and the oldest was 149. They were weaned on average at 205 days of age. And that occurred on January 22nd at Meade and January 24th at Mitchell, just to give you an idea of the time of the year. The calves at Meade experienced some respiratory disease. So there were no calves that got respiratory disease at Mitchell. All of the respiratory disease occurred at Meade. So 10 of the 39 calves that they had alive at weaning were treated. That was 26% of them. Of those 10 BRD cases, 7 of them were in the weaned group. And there were 3 of them that were with their moms that got sick. So there was much greater, about double the risk for BRD among the weaned calves than the ones that stayed with their moms. But because of the small numbers, that could have just been chance. Anyways, looking at when they got sick. So they were weaned on September 20. They were weaned on September 27th. About 3 weeks later, calves started getting sick. So you might think that the weaning precipitated some illness, and it probably did. But notice that in that time period when calves began to get sick, even calves in the non-weaned group got sick at the same time. There was some secondary cases that may have been secondary from some of these, or these may have been exposures from other steers or cattle in the feedlot. So the incidence of BRD clustered within time as we're in a very tight period of time. If we look at how old were those calves when they got sick, so again you'll see, as I showed you earlier, that the time that calves were at risk for getting sick was when most of them got sick between 100 and 110 days of age. So that time period of between 90 and 120 days of age, when calves are particularly susceptible to BRD, played out in the herds here at Meade. Okay, so the conclusions that we can draw, and this is a small part of this study, and we've got a lot more years to go, but what we saw in the UNL cow-calf confinement study were the same hazards that we might predict to be problems. Health problems to cows and calves during calving, dangers from the environment, and contagious diseases. And the hope is that by anticipating these problems, thinking about the system that you're operating, you may be able to anticipate their occurrence, manage the risk factors that are known to prevent those things, and make sure that everybody on the team understands what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay. Thanks. Again, it's good to be back in Nebraska, and I appreciate your attention.